From above, the pattern feels strange. A tight cluster of tall buildings, then suddenly, nothing. Not neighborhoods, not markets, not streets full of life. Just empty space, parking lots, highways cutting through the grid like scars. And if you've ever wondered why downtown America looks so different from downtowns in Europe, Asia, or Latin America, the answer isn't style, it isn't culture. It's design decisions made decades ago that quietly reshaped how Americans live, move, and even relate to one another. Tonight, we're uncovering how history, planning, and power transformed the American downtown and what those choices still mean today.
The strange shape of American downtowns. If you look at an American city from above, the pattern feels instantly familiar. A dense cluster of tall buildings rises at the center, glass, steel, concrete, and height compressed into a tight core. A skyline that signals importance, power, economic gravity. This is downtown. But what happens next is what makes American cities feel so different. Just beyond that cluster, density doesn't gently soften. It doesn't gradually transition into lively neighborhoods or continuous urban fabric. Instead, it drops abruptly. Office towers give way to wide roads. Those roads give way to surface parking lots. And those parking lots stretch outward, block after block, until highways take over completely. From the air, it almost looks unfinished, as if the city was carefully designed in the center and then quietly abandoned around it. This shape is not subtle. Once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And more importantly, you can feel it on the ground. Many American downtowns feel impressive but strangely hollow. Busy during work hours, then suddenly empty. Central, yet disconnected from daily life. A place people commute to, not a place they linger in. For decades, Americans have tried to explain this feeling in cultural terms. They say it's about lifestyle, about preferences, about weather or safety or economics. But those explanations only scratch the surface. The deeper truth is this: downtown America does not look this way by accident. It looks this way because it was designed to. To understand why downtown America feels different, we have to stop thinking of cities as organic outcomes. American downtowns are not just the result of time passing. They are the result of decisions. Planning decisions, policy decisions, design decisions. And many of those decisions were made deliberately, with confidence, optimism, and a strong belief in progress. This documentary is not about blaming the past. It's about understanding it. Because the form of American downtowns tells a story, not just about architecture, but about values. In most cities around the world, downtown is not a single zone. It blends outward. Residential neighborhoods overlap with commercial streets. Shops, cafes, housing, offices, and public life exist side by side. Density decreases slowly, almost imperceptibly. The city feels continuous. In contrast, many American cities feel fragmented. Downtown feels isolated, almost like an island. This difference is not a coincidence of geography. It is the physical outcome of 20th century urban planning. When American downtowns were first formed, they did not look like this. They were dense, walkable, and mixed by necessity. People lived near where they worked. They walked or used streetcars. Urban life was compressed into tight spaces. Downtown was not an office district. It was a living system. But over time, that system was dismantled, not all at once, but piece by piece. And the first major shift was subtle. Cities began to prioritize movement over presence. From the perspective of planners in the early 20th century, the city felt inefficient. Streets were crowded. Traffic mixed with pedestrians. Movement was slow. Then came a new technology that promised to solve all of it: the automobile. At first,
Cars were treated as guests in the city. They shared the street. They adapted to the existing urban form. But as their numbers grew, the balance broke. Cities faced a choice. They could limit cars, or they could redesign themselves around them. American cities chose the second option, and downtowns were the first places to change. What followed was not chaos, but order. Highly rational order. Downtown streets were widened to increase traffic flow. Intersections were redesigned to reduce conflict. Buildings were set back to improve visibility. From a technical perspective, this made sense. But every technical improvement came with a spatial cost. Wide streets made crossing uncomfortable. Long blocks reduced walkability. Buildings pulled away from sidewalks. The human scale, the subtle proportions that make urban spaces feel welcoming, began to disappear. Downtowns became places to pass through, not places to inhabit. The most important thing to understand is this. American downtowns did not decline randomly. They were optimized. Optimized for cars. Optimized for commuters. Optimized for efficiency measured in speed and throughput. And optimization always creates trade-offs. When cities optimize for movement, they often sacrifice intimacy. When they optimize for access, they weaken proximity. Downtown America became extremely accessible and increasingly unlivable. This is why downtowns often feel disconnected from surrounding neighborhoods. Not because neighborhoods don't exist, but because the space between them has been hollowed out. Parking lots replace buildings. Roads widen into barriers.
Highways carve edges that are difficult to cross. The city no longer feels continuous. It feels segmented. For decades, this design logic went largely unquestioned. It aligned with American ideals of mobility, independence, and growth. It supported suburban expansion. It fueled economic development. And for a long time, it worked. Downtowns grew vertically. Skylines became symbols of success. Office towers concentrated economic power. But something was quietly lost in the process: life. By the late 20th century, many American downtowns functioned almost exclusively as employment centers. People arrived in the morning, they left in the evening. Restaurants adjusted to lunch crowds. Retail adapted to office schedules. Public spaces emptied after dark. Downtowns were no longer ecosystems. They were machines, efficient during business hours, inactive the rest of the time. This is why so many American downtowns feel oddly silent at night. Not unsafe necessarily, just empty. That emptiness is not a failure of people. It is the result of design. Understanding this changes the conversation. It shifts the focus away from blaming culture or behavior and toward examining the systems that shaped the city. Because cities are not neutral, they express priorities. And American downtowns express a very specific set of 20th century priorities: mobility, efficiency, separation, and scale. Downtown America looks different because it was built to function differently. And once we understand that, we can finally begin to ask better questions. Not just why downtowns feel the way they do, but whether they still need to.
What downtown used to be. Before highways, before zoning codes, before parking minimums and traffic engineering manuals, downtown America was something very different. To understand how deeply downtowns have changed, we need to return to a time when American cities were shaped less by policy and more by necessity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the American downtown was not a specialized district. It was not an office core. And it was not something you drove to. It was where life happened. At the turn of the 20th century, American cities were dense by default. Most people could not afford long daily travel. Walking was the primary mode of movement. Streetcars extended reach, but only along fixed lines. Distance was expensive. Time mattered. And proximity was everything. As a result, downtowns compressed activities into tight spaces. Shops occupied the ground floor. Offices filled the levels above. Apartments stacked on top of both. This vertical mix-in was not a stylistic choice. It was practical.
If you worked downtown, you lived nearby. If you ran a business, your customers were already on the street. Downtown was not separated from daily life. It was embedded within it. These early downtowns were noisy, crowded, and imperfect. But they were alive. Streets were narrow by today's standards. Blocks were short. Buildings met the sidewalk directly. Public life spilled outward. People walked to work. They walked to shop. They walked to socialize. The street itself functioned as a shared civic space. Movement was slow enough to notice faces, to stop, to interact. Urban life was not optimized for speed. It was organized around presence. In this period, American downtowns shared a common logic with cities across the world. They were not uniquely American in form. From New York to Chicago, from San Francisco to Boston, downtowns followed a similar pattern. Dense cores surrounded by gradually thinning neighborhoods. There was no sharp edge between downtown and the rest of the city. Instead, there was continuity. Shops faded into houses. Houses blended into smaller streets. The city softened outward. This continuity mattered. It meant downtown did not feel like a separate zone. It felt like the heart of a larger organism. Transportation reinforced this structure. Streetcars allowed cities to grow, but they did not fragment them. Unlike highways, streetcar lines encouraged density along their routes. They pulled development inward, not outward. Neighborhoods formed around stops. Daily life remained connected to downtown. Even early automobiles existed within this system. They were present but not dominant. Streets still belonged primarily to people. It is important to understand that early American downtowns were not designed by grand theory. They evolved. They adapted incrementally. One building at a time. One block at a time. This slow evolution created resilience. If a shop failed, another took its place. If a building aged, it was repurposed. Downtowns adjusted without collapsing. They were flexible because they were mixed. Downtown was not just an economic center. It was a social one. Civic buildings, theaters, libraries, courthouses, and public squares clustered together. People encountered one another across social boundaries. Work and leisure overlapped. Public and private life intersected. The city felt shared. This mattered more than we often acknowledge. Urban form shapes social interaction. When people occupy the same spaces for different reasons, cities feel alive. Early downtowns made this unavoidable. But even in this period, pressures were building. As cities grew, congestion increased.
Streets became crowded. Conflicts between pedestrians, streetcars, and early automobiles multiplied. From a planner's perspective, the city began to feel chaotic, messy, inefficient. And this perception would prove decisive. By the early 20th century, American planners were increasingly influenced by ideas of order, separation, and control. They believed cities could be rationalized, streamlined, improved. Urban life, in their view, needed clearer organization. Functions should be separated. Movement should be faster. Conflict should be minimized. This mindset did not emerge in a vacuum. It reflected broader cultural shifts. Industrial efficiency, scientific management, faith in systems. Cities were no longer seen as organic places. They were seen as problems to be solved. At the same time, technology was offering a solution that felt inevitable. The automobile. Cars promised freedom, flexibility, individual control. They allowed people to live farther away from where they worked. At first, this was seen as an advantage. Crowded downtowns could be relieved. Housing could spread outward. Streets could move traffic more efficiently.
The underlying assumption was simple. Cities would become better if they were less dense. This idea marked a profound shift. Density, once understood as efficiency, began to be seen as a problem. Crowding was no longer a sign of vitality, it was a sign of disorder. Downtown, once the most desirable place to be, became something to escape from. This shift in perception laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Because once density became suspect, the logic of the city changed. What had once been an ecosystem began to fragment. Housing was no longer essential to downtown. It could be placed elsewhere. Retail could follow customers outward. Entertainment could be decentralized. Downtown no longer needed to support life at all hours. It only needed to support work. This was not yet the outcome, but it was the direction. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize early downtowns, to imagine them as perfect, harmonious places. They were not. They were unequal, often polluted, and frequently overcrowded. But they possessed something modern downtowns often lack: continuity. Life did not stop at the edge of the workday. Activity did not depend on commuting patterns. Downtowns were resilient because they were necessary. People needed to be there. This is the key difference. Early American downtowns were unavoidable. They concentrated daily life because alternatives were limited. As transportation expanded and planning priorities shifted, downtowns became optional. And once a place becomes optional, it must compete with suburbs, with highways, with convenience. The form of downtown America would soon reflect that competition. Understanding what downtown used to be is not about nostalgia. It is about contrast. Because without this baseline, the transformation that follows makes no sense. Downtown did not start as an empty core surrounded by asphalt. It was shaped that way, slowly, deliberately, and with confidence that progress required it. In the next part, we reach the turning point, the moment when the automobile stops being a guest in the city and becomes its primary design reference, when streets stop serving people and start serving movement, and when downtown America begins to lose the qualities that once made it feel alive.
The automobile rewrites the city. The transformation of American downtowns did not begin with destruction. It began with optimism. When automobiles first appeared in American cities, they were not seen as a threat to urban life. They were seen as a solution. At the start of the 20th century, cities were growing rapidly. Streets were crowded. Movement was slow. Noise, congestion, and conflict defined the urban experience. To many planners, the city felt overwhelmed by its own success. The automobile promised something radical: speed, flexibility, and personal freedom. For the first time, individuals could choose where to live independently of streetcar lines or walking distance. Work and home no longer needed to be close. At first, this seemed liberating. In the early years, cars were absorbed into the existing city. They shared space with pedestrians. They navigated streets designed for people, horses, and streetcars. But as automobiles became cheaper and widely available, the balance collapsed. Streets that had once functioned as shared public spaces became contested terrain. Accidents increased. Congestion worsened. Urban life felt chaotic. From the perspective of planners and engineers, the problem seemed clear. The city was not designed for cars. And so instead of limiting automobiles, American cities chose a different path. They redesigned themselves. This was a pivotal moment. Rather than asking how cars could fit into cities, planners asked how cities could fit cars. It was a subtle shift in thinking, but its consequences were profound. Streets were widened to increase traffic flow. Curbs were pushed back. Intersections were redesigned to prioritize turning radii and visibility. Sidewalks shrank. Crossing distances grew longer. What had once been pedestrian environments became corridors for movement. These changes were framed as improvements. Wider roads meant faster travel. Clearer sightlines meant safety. Traffic flow became the central metric of success. Urban space was no longer evaluated by how it felt to occupy. It was evaluated by how efficiently it moved vehicles. Speed replaced proximity as the measure of progress. Downtowns were especially vulnerable to this new logic. They were dense, they were congested, and they sat at the center of regional movement. If traffic could be solved downtown, it could be solved anywhere. And so downtown streets were transformed first. Buildings were set back from the street to create space. Historic structures were removed to widen corridors. Public squares became intersections. The city began to stretch horizontally. This transformation did not happen because planners disliked people. It happened because they believed in systems. Traffic engineering emerged as a discipline. Flow diagrams replaced street life. Urban complexity was reduced to data. Cars were counted. Speeds were measured. Delays were minimized. Human experience, difficult to quantify, faded from the conversation. As the automobile became central to planning, downtowns lost something essential. They lost friction. Friction slows movement, but it creates interaction. It encourages stopping, lingering, and observing. When friction is removed, movement increases, but presence disappears. Downtowns became smoother, faster, and less intimate. The rise of the automobile also reshaped scale. Cities began to be designed around the dimensions of machines rather than bodies. Lanes widened, intersections expanded, blocks grew longer. Distances that once felt walkable became uncomfortable. What looked efficient from behind the wheel felt hostile on foot. This is not an aesthetic failure, it is a geometric one. As driving became normalized, expectations shifted. People began to assume they would drive downtown. This assumption reshaped everything that followed. If people were driving, they needed somewhere to park. If streets were carrying traffic, they needed to move it quickly. Downtown was no longer a place you arrived at slowly. It was a node in a transportation network. This reframing was subtle but decisive. The automobile also enabled decentralization. For the first time, businesses could locate farther from the urban core without losing access to workers or customers. Housing followed. People could live farther away. They could choose space over proximity. Suburban growth accelerated. And downtown, once unavoidable, became optional. As this happened, the role of downtown quietly changed. It was no longer the center of everyday life. It became the center of employment. Work concentrated, life dispersed. This separation would soon be reinforced by policy. But even before zoning formalized it, the automobile made it possible. It is important to recognize that this shift was not universally criticized at the time. Many saw it as progress. Cities felt more modern, movement felt easier, growth felt unlimited.
The downsides were not immediately visible. They emerged slowly, block by block, street by street. By the time the effects became obvious, the logic was deeply embedded. Downtowns had been redesigned for movement, not dwelling. They had been optimized for speed, not presence. And once a city is built around cars, reversing that logic becomes difficult. Every widened street invites faster traffic. Every setback discourages walking. Every accommodation reinforces the system. The automobile did not simply enter the city, it rewrote it. This rewriting set the stage for the next major transformation. If cities were going to function efficiently around cars, planners believed they needed clearer organization, separation, order, predictability. And that belief would soon be codified into one of the most powerful tools in urban history: zoning.
Zoning and the death of urban mix. By the time the automobile began reshaping American cities, planners were already searching for a way to impose order on what they saw as urban chaos. Cities felt crowded, noisy, unpredictable. Factories operated near homes. Shops spilled into residential streets. Different activities overlapped in ways that felt inefficient and, to many, unsafe. The solution that emerged promised clarity: zoning. Zoning was introduced as a rational tool. It offered a simple idea: different functions should be separated. Homes in one area, offices in another, retail somewhere else, industry kept far away. On paper, zoning and the death of urban mix. By the time the automobile began reshaping American cities, planners were already searching for a way to impose order on what they saw as urban chaos. Cities felt crowded, noisy, unpredictable. Factories operated near homes. Shops spilled into residential streets. Different activities overlapped in ways that felt inefficient and, to many, unsafe. The solution that emerged promised clarity: zoning. Zoning was introduced as a rational tool. It offered a simple idea: different functions should be separated. Homes in one area, offices in another, retail somewhere else, industry kept far away. On paper, this seemed reasonable. Residential neighborhoods would be protected from noise and pollution. Businesses would operate without complaint. Cities would become more orderly. But this logic misunderstood something fundamental about how cities function. Early American downtowns worked precisely because uses were mixed. Housing, commerce, and culture overlapped. Life continued throughout the day and into the night. When zoning laws began enforcing separation, they quietly dismantled this resilience. Downtowns did not collapse overnight. They thinned. Housing was the first to go. Under single-use zoning, residential buildings were often restricted or discouraged in central business districts. Planners believed downtown should focus on productivity. Housing could be placed elsewhere. This decision would prove decisive. Without residents, downtown lost its permanent population. People no longer had a reason to be there outside of work hours. Retail followed a similar path. Shops no longer needed to locate downtown to reach customers. Cars allowed consumers to travel farther. Shopping centers emerged outside the urban core. Retail dispersed. Downtowns became less diverse. What remained was office space. This shift reshaped the daily rhythm of downtown life. In the morning, workers arrived. In the evening, they left. Restaurants adapted to lunch crowds. Services catered to office schedules. After dark, downtown emptied. Not because people were afraid, but because there was no reason to stay. Single-use zoning created districts that were efficient but fragile. A downtown built almost entirely on offices depends on constant inflow. When that flow stops, activity collapses. The city becomes hollow. This fragility was not immediately obvious. For decades, downtowns thrived during business hours. Skylines grew taller. Corporate headquarters expanded. From the outside, downtowns appeared successful. But success masked imbalance. Zoning also reinforced scale. Large office buildings replaced smaller, mixed-use structures. Blocks grew bigger, buildings grew taller, streets grew wider. This amplified the effects of automobile-oriented planning. Downtowns became places designed for peak efficiency at peak hours. Everything else was secondary. It's important to understand that zoning did not emerge as a conspiracy. It reflected a broader belief in rational systems. Mid-20th century America trusted experts, planners, engineers, economists. Cities were seen as machines that could be optimized. Complexity was treated as a flaw. But cities are not machines. They are living systems. When functions are separated too strictly, cities lose adaptability. If an office district declines, there are no residents to sustain it. If retail struggles, there is no foot traffic to support it. Mixed-use environments can absorb shocks. Single-use environments cannot. Downtown America became vulnerable by design. Zoning also shaped who belonged downtown. As housing moved outward, downtowns became spaces primarily for workers, not residents. This separation had social consequences. Public life diminished. Casual interaction declined. Downtown became transactional. You went there to do something, work, file paperwork, attend a meeting. You did not go there to live. Over time, this altered how Americans related to their cities. Downtown was no longer part of everyday identity. It became an abstract concept, a place on the map, a destination, not a neighborhood. Zoning laws also reinforced automobile dependency. Separated land uses meant longer distances. Longer distances meant driving. Walking became impractical. Public transit struggled to serve dispersed destinations. The system fit itself. Each separation justified the next. By mid-century, zoning had become deeply entrenched. It shaped not only new development but redevelopment.
Buildings that did not conform were demolished or enclosed. The mixed-use fabric that once defined downtowns was slowly erased. Not violently, methodically. Looking back, it's tempting to judge these decisions harshly, but they reflected the priorities of their time. Order over spontaneity, efficiency over complexity, separation over logarithm. Downtown America became cleaner, quieter, and more controlled.
But it also became less alive. The death of urban mix did not happen because planners disliked cities. It happened because they misunderstood what made them work. They believed order would create vitality. Instead, it drained it. By the time the consequences became clear, the system was self-reinforcing. Downtowns had been rebuilt around offices. Housing had dispersed. Retail had followed the suburbs. Reintroducing life would require undoing decades of policy, and that would not be easy. Zoning set the stage for the next transformation. If downtowns were going to function as commuter centers, planners believed they needed to accommodate vehicles efficiently. That meant one thing above all else: parking.
Parking as policy. Once cities reorganized themselves around automobiles, one question became unavoidable. Where would all the cars go when they stopped moving? The answer, increasingly, was downtown. As driving became the assumed way to access the city, planners faced a new problem. Traffic might move through downtown, but cars still needed to rest somewhere. And that requirement would quietly reshape the city more dramatically than almost any building ever could. Parking was not initially controversial. It was framed as a technical necessity. If people were expected to drive, they needed places to park. If downtown was going to function efficiently, parking had to be convenient. This logic felt neutral, practical, almost invisible. But over time, parking stopped being a choice. It became a mandate. Across the United States, cities began adopting minimum parking requirements. New buildings were required to provide a specific number of parking spaces, often calculated per square foot or per unit. These requirements applied even in the most central, walkable areas. Developers were not asked whether parking made sense. They were told how much was required. This single policy decision would have enormous consequences. Downtown land is expensive. Historically, it was used intensively. Buildings rose vertically because land was valuable. Space was conserved. Parking reversed that logic. Cars require space, far more space than people. A single parking space occupies more land than an average office desk. Surface lots consume entire blocks. When parking became mandatory, buildings shrank and asphalt expanded. Downtowns began to flatten. In many cities, historic structures were demolished not because they were unsafe or unwanted, but because they did not provide parking. A building might be economically viable, architecturally sound, culturally meaningful. But without parking, it was considered obsolete. The land beneath it was more valuable as storage for vehicles. This transformation happened incrementally, one lot at a time, one block at a time. But the cumulative effect was profound. Downtowns developed gaps. Empty spaces where buildings once stood. Asphalt fields interrupting the urban fabric. Walking became less pleasant. Streets felt longer. Destinations felt further apart. Downtown lost its rhythm. Parking lots are not neutral spaces. They create distance. They discourage lingering. They break visual continuity. When you walk past a storefront, there is something to see, something to engage with. When you walk past a parking lot, there is nothing. The street becomes a corridor instead of a place. Parking requirements also distorted development economics. To meet minimums, developers often had to build structured parking. Parking garages are expensive. They generate little revenue. They consume valuable space. To compensate, buildings became larger and more specialized. Small-scale, mixed-use projects became financially difficult. The city lost fine-grained development. What remained were larger, more isolated structures. In this way, parking policy reinforced the effects of zoning. Downtowns became less mixed, less adaptable, more rigid. They were designed to accommodate peak demand, not daily life. Parking had to be available for the busiest hours of the busiest days. For the rest of the time, those spaces sat empty. The irony is hard to ignore. Downtown land, often the most valuable land in a region, was devoted to storing vehicles that were not in use. Cars that occupied downtown parking spaces were often there for only a few hours. Yet entire city blocks were sacrificed to accommodate them. This was not market demand, it was policy. As parking spread, downtowns became more fragmented. Distances between buildings increased. Walking routes became less direct. Public space felt less inviting. This fragmentation reinforced car dependence. The more unpleasant it became to walk downtown, the more people chose to drive.
And the more people drove, the more parking was required. The system fed itself. Parking also shaped perception. Visitors arriving downtown encountered asphalt before architecture. The first impression was not a street full of life, but a lot full of cars. Downtown felt empty even when it was technically busy. Life was hidden inside buildings. Public space was reduced to circulation. Over time, parking requirements became so normalized that they were rarely questioned. They were seen as common sense. Of course buildings need parking. Of course downtown must accommodate cars. But these assumptions were never tested against alternatives. They were inherited. It's important to understand that parking policy was not driven by hostility toward cities. It was driven by accommodation. Cities tried to make downtown accessible to suburban commuters. They tried to compete with suburban convenience.
In doing so, they adopted suburban logic, and that logic reshaped the urban core. The result was paradoxical. Downtowns became easier to drive to, but less pleasant to be in. They became more accessible, but less alive. Parking solved one problem while creating several others. By the late 20th century, many American downtowns were dominated not by buildings, but by space between them. Asphalt became the most visible architectural element. This is one of the most striking visual differences between American downtowns and those elsewhere in the world. Not the height of buildings, not the style of architecture, but the emptiness between structures. Parking did not merely respond to demand, it created it. By making driving the default, parking requirements ensured that alternatives struggled to compete. Public transit became harder to support, walking became less appealing, density became more difficult to achieve. Downtown locked themselves into car dependence. Only recently have cities begun to question this system. Some have removed minimum parking requirements, others have converted lots back into buildings. But the legacy remains visible. The shape of downtown America still bears the imprint of decades of parking-first policy. Parking was never just about convenience, it was about values. It prioritized movement over presence, vehicles over people, access over experience, and in doing so, it permanently altered the character of American downtowns.
Highways through the heart. By the mid-20th century, American cities had already bent themselves to the automobile. Streets were widened, parking lots spread, zoning separated uses. But one intervention would cut deeper than all the others combined. Highways. Not around cities, through them. The interstate highway system is often remembered as a triumph of engineering, and in many ways it was. It connected regions, it reduced travel times, it fueled economic growth. But its urban impact was far more complicated, because when highways entered cities, they did not behave like roads. They behaved like borders. Federal highway funding encouraged cities to route freeways directly into downtown cores. The logic seemed straightforward. Downtown was the destination. Highways should go where people wanted to go. What was rarely considered was what stood in the way: entire neighborhoods. Urban highways required space, a lot of it. Not just lanes for cars, but interchanges, ramps, shoulders, buffers, and service roads. In dense city centers, that space could only come from demolition. And demolition came at a scale cities had never seen before. Blocks were cleared. Streets were erased. Buildings were removed not individually, but wholesale. What remained was a new kind of urban void, linear, elevated, sunken, or trenched. A physical scar. Highways were not placed randomly. They followed paths of least political resistance. Neighborhoods with less power were more vulnerable. Working-class districts, communities of color, areas already labeled as blighted by urban renewal policies. Highways became tools of displacement. In many cities, highways sliced directly through established downtown-adjacent neighborhoods, places where people lived, worked, and built social networks. The road did not just remove buildings, it removed continuity. What had once been a short walk became an impassable divide. Highways changed how downtowns functioned. They accelerated commuter access. Suburban residents could drive straight into the city core. But they also made downtown something to pass through rather than inhabit. The city became a destination for work, not for life. Elevated highways cast shadows. They block views. They fill the air with noise. What lay beneath them often became leftover space, hostile to pedestrians, difficult to develop, psychologically uncomfortable. These were not places people chose to linger. Sunken highways created different problems.
They formed trenches that were hard to cross. Bridges replaced streets. Connections multiplied, but continuity disappeared. Downtowns became fragmented landscapes stitched together by overpasses. In some cities, highways ran along waterfronts. Land that once connected the city to water was turned into traffic corridors. Public access was severed. The city turned its back on its most valuable natural assets, all in the name of speed. Highways also reshaped downtown land use. Areas near interchanges were no longer desirable for housing. Noise and pollution discouraged residential development. What remained were offices, parking structures, and transient uses. Downtowns lost population, and with fewer residents came fewer reasons to stay after business hours. This accelerated the cycle already in motion. Downtown as workplace, suburbs as home. Highways didn't just respond to suburbanization, they institutionalized it. The scale of highway infrastructure overwhelmed human-scale urban design. Interchanges replaced intersections. Ramps replaced streets. The logic of movement replaced the logic of place. Cities were no longer experienced at walking speed. They were experienced at 60 miles per hour. Once built, highways were difficult to undo. They represented massive public investment. Removing them felt unthinkable, so cities adapted around them. They built inward. They retreated. They accepted fragmentation as normal. For decades, this was treated as progress. Congestion was framed as a technical problem. Capacity was the solution. More lanes, bigger interchanges. But each expansion reinforced dependence. The more capacity cities added, the more traffic arrived. Downtowns became conduits for regional movement, rather than destinations in themselves. The psychological impact was just as significant as the physical one. Highways created mental maps of separation. Neighborhoods on opposite sides of a freeway felt far apart, even if geographically close. Downtowns felt isolated from surrounding communities. The city center became an island. Only later did cities begin to recognize what had been lost. The streets that once connected neighborhoods, the density that supported local businesses, the human-scale environments that fostered social life. By then, the damage was already embedded in concrete. In recent years, some cities have attempted repair.
Highways have been capped. Segments have been removed. Waterfronts have been reclaimed. But these efforts are expensive, slow, and politically complex. Undoing highways is far harder than building them. Still, the visual legacy remains unmistakable. Aerial views of American downtowns reveal massive corridors of asphalt slicing through the urban fabric. These are not accidents. They are deliberate decisions made decades ago. Decisions that prioritized speed over cohesion. Highways did not destroy American downtowns, but they fundamentally altered them. They transformed centers of interaction into nodes of access. They reshaped cities around vehicles rather than people. And once that transformation occurred, everything else followed.
Downtown as office, not home. By the late 20th century, the physical transformation of American downtowns was largely complete. Zoning had separated uses. Parking had hollowed out blocks. Highways had cut through neighborhoods. But the most consequential change was not visible from the air. It was demographic. Downtown was no longer where people lived. It was where they went. For much of American urban history, downtowns were residential. People lived above shops. Families occupied apartments near workplaces. Daily life unfolded within walking distance. This proximity shaped social rhythms. Morning, afternoon, and evening activity blended together. Downtown never truly slept. As car-oriented planning took hold, this balance shifted. Housing became increasingly suburban. Downtown land was reserved for offices, government buildings, and commercial uses. Residential development was often discouraged or outright prohibited. Living downtown became the exception, not the norm. Office buildings replaced apartments. Single-use towers dominated the skyline. At peak hours, downtown filled with workers. At night, it emptied. The city center became a place of schedules rather than routines. This transformation changed how downtowns felt. Streets were busy during the day and quiet after dark. Retail struggled to survive without evening customers. Public space felt temporary, designed for movement rather than lingering. Downtown lost its sense of permanence. The absence of residents had cascading effects. Without a stable population, services disappeared. Grocery stores closed. Schools relocated. Everyday amenities became scarce. Downtown was no longer designed for life. It was designed for productivity. This shift also altered political priorities. People who live somewhere advocate for it. They demand safety, cleanliness, and public investment. Commuters have less incentive to engage. They experience the city episodically. Downtown governance reflected this imbalance. Office-centered downtowns became highly sensitive to economic cycles. When business was strong, they thrived. When recessions hit, they emptied quickly. Without residents to stabilize activity, downturns were more severe. Downtowns lacked resilience. The monoculture of office use also shaped architecture. Buildings were optimized for efficiency, not adaptability.
Large floor plates, centralized cores, standardized designs. These structures worked well for offices, but poorly for housing. Converting them later would prove difficult. The timing of activity became synchronized. Rush hours surged, midday peaked, evenings declined. Infrastructure was built to handle brief periods of maximum demand. For the rest of the day, it sat underused. This inefficiency was treated as normal. Downtown's identity narrowed. It became a financial district, a government center, a corporate hub. Culture was often pushed elsewhere, into entertainment districts or suburban venues. The city center lost its emotional pull. Safety perceptions followed. Empty streets felt unsafe even if crime rates were low. The lack of eyes on the street made downtown feel abandoned. This perception discouraged residents from returning. The cycle reinforced itself. Some cities attempted revitalization through spectacle. Convention centers, sports arenas, festival marketplaces. These projects brought bursts of activity, but not continuity. They did not replace everyday life. Downtown remained episodic. The separation between home and work became spatially entrenched. Long commutes were normalized. Daily life was split across geographies. Downtown was something to endure, not inhabit. Yet this model was rarely questioned. It aligned with broader economic trends. Corporate consolidation, automobile dominance, suburban growth. Downtowns reflected national priorities. By the early 21st century, the weaknesses of the system became harder to ignore. Office vacancies rose, retail declined, public space felt underutilized. Downtowns struggled to adapt. They had been optimized for a single function. The contrast with older urban centers, both in the US and abroad, became increasingly clear. Places with mixed-use residential downtowns proved more resilient. They supported transit. They sustained street life. They adapted to change. American downtowns lagged behind. Only recently has there been a serious push to reverse this pattern. Residential conversions, mixed-use zoning, efforts to bring people back downtown. But the legacy of decades of office-centered planning remains. The buildings, the streets, the expectations. Downtown America looks different not because it lacks history, but because its history took a particular path. A path that separated living from working, presence from productivity, place from purpose.
Shocks, decline, and reinvention. American downtowns were already under strain long before the 21st century arrived. They had been reshaped around cars, stripped of residents, optimized for office work. But it took a series of shocks to fully reveal how fragile this model had become. Shocks that forced cities to confront the limits of their own design. The first major shock was economic. Deindustrialization had already weakened many urban cores. Manufacturing jobs left cities, taking middle-class stability with them. Downtowns that relied on corporate offices and finance became increasingly exposed to global market swings. When companies downsized, entire districts emptied almost overnight. Retail followed. Big box stores and shopping malls drew customers away from downtown streets. Online commerce accelerated the decline. Without residents to support everyday retail, downtown storefronts struggled to survive. Vacancy became common. Life thinned out. Yet even as these pressures mounted, the underlying model remained largely unchanged. Cities continued to plan for peak commuting demand. Office towers rose. Parking structures expanded. Downtown was still treated as a machine for work. Then came the most disruptive shock of all: remote work. Suddenly, millions of office workers no longer needed to be downtown every day. The commute, once assumed to be unavoidable, became optional. Downtown's primary reason for existing was questioned in real time. Office occupancy collapsed. Buildings that had been full 5 days a week sat half empty. Lunch crowds disappeared. Transit ridership plummeted. The rhythms that sustained downtown life broke apart. What became visible was not just economic vulnerability, but spatial imbalance. Downtowns built for commuters lacked the everyday density needed to remain active without them. They had no backup population, no built-in resilience. Public perception shifted quickly. Empty offices became symbols of decline. Quiet streets felt unsettling. Narratives of urban failure resurfaced. Downtowns were once again described as obsolete. But something else happened at the same time. The shock forced experimentation. Cities could no longer rely on old assumptions. They had to reconsider what downtown was for. Some cities accelerated residential conversion. Office buildings were reimagined as apartments. Zoning barriers were relaxed. Mixed-use development gained new legitimacy. The idea of living downtown was no longer fringe. Public space also came under renewed scrutiny. If people weren't commuting, why design streets only for cars? Pedestrianization expanded. Outdoor dining appeared. Temporary interventions tested new ways of using space. Downtown began to feel more human, even if emptier. Cultural uses gained importance. Art, events, and public programming filled gaps left by offices. Downtown was reframed as a social and cultural environment, not just an economic one. The narrative began to shift. Not every city adapted equally. Downtowns with flexible building stock fared better. Those with smaller blocks, mixed uses, and historic structures proved easier to repurpose. Places built entirely around modern office towers struggled. Design history mattered.
The shock exposed a fundamental truth. Cities that had prioritized efficiency over adaptability paid a price. Downtowns optimized for one function had little capacity to absorb change. Reinvention was uneven and contested. Some residents resisted change. Some businesses clung to old models. Political debates intensified. But the direction was clear. The old commuter-centric downtown was no longer viable. This period also triggered a broader cultural reckoning. People began to ask deeper questions. What is downtown for? Who is it designed to serve? What does a successful city center look like in an era of flexibility? Downtowns that leaned into diversity of use, housing, culture, education, recreation, began to stabilize. Those that waited for office life to return to normal often stalled. Adaptation required letting go of the past. The shock did not destroy downtown America, but it stripped away illusions. It revealed how deeply design choices made decades earlier still shaped outcomes, and it made clear that reinvention was not optional. Today, downtown America stands at a crossroads. The scars of car-centric planning remain visible, but so do new possibilities that depend on understanding the past.
Why other downtowns feel different? To understand why American downtowns look the way they do, comparison is unavoidable. Not comparison as judgment, but comparison as clarity. When we look at downtowns elsewhere, across Europe, East Asia, and parts of Latin America, the contrast is immediate. Not in wealth, not in ambition, but in form, rhythm, and experience. Many non-American city centers feel continuous. Blocks are compact, buildings line the street, ground floors are active. Walking feels intuitive. This is not because those cities are older or more romantic, it is because they were shaped by different assumptions. In many places, the default unit of movement was the pedestrian. Streets evolved around human scale. Distances were measured in minutes, not miles. Even after automobiles arrived, they were layered onto existing urban fabrics rather than replacing them. Crucially, downtowns elsewhere rarely separated uses as rigidly. Housing, retail, offices, and civic functions coexist. People live near where they work. Streets remain active throughout the day and evening. Downtown feels inhabited, not scheduled. Parking plays a different role. In many cities, it is limited, shared, or priced to reflect scarcity. Buildings are not required to provide vast amounts of parking. As a result, land remains devoted to people-oriented uses. Density is preserved. Public transit is treated as essential infrastructure. Downtowns are designed around stations, not interchanges. Accessibility does not depend on car ownership. This broadens who can participate in city life. Highways are typically kept at the edge. When they do enter cities, they are often tunneled or carefully integrated. They do not dominate the urban landscape. Continuity is protected. These differences are not cultural accidents, they are policy outcomes. Decisions about zoning, parking, and infrastructure accumulated over decades. Each choice reinforced a particular vision of the city. American downtowns made different choices. They prioritized speed over proximity, efficiency over adaptability, movement over presence. These priorities shaped the physical environment. The contrast becomes most visible at street level. In many global downtowns, streets invite wandering. There is something to see every few steps. American downtown streets often feel longer and emptier, not because they lack buildings, but because space is diluted. This dilution affects social life. Spontaneous interaction becomes rarer. Public space feels transitional rather than communal. Downtown becomes something to pass through. Importantly, these differences are not inevitable. They are not the result of geography or destiny. They are the product of specific decisions made at specific moments. American cities could have chosen differently. Some did, partially. Even within the United States, variation exists. Downtowns that retained mixed-use patterns feel different. Places with limited parking and strong transit perform better. The model was never uniform. Looking abroad helps reveal what American downtowns lost, but it also reveals what they can regain. Density without congestion, activity without spectacle, life without constant motion. The lesson is not imitation, it is understanding. Cities are systems. Change one rule and everything else responds. American downtowns did not fail. They followed the logic they were given. Now, that logic is being reconsidered. The comparison is no longer abstract. It is a guide.
What downtown America can become. American downtowns are often discussed as problems to be solved. Too empty, too car-dependent, too fragmented. But that framing misses something essential. Downtown America is not broken. It is unfinished. What we see today is not the natural endpoint of urban evolution. It is the visible result of choices layered over time. Zoning decisions, infrastructure investments, economic assumptions. Downtown looks the way it does because it was designed that way, and design can change.
The most important realization of the past decade is this: downtown does not need to return to what it was. It needs to become something it has never fully been. A place designed for presence, not just productivity. This shift begins with a reframing of purpose. If downtown exists only to host offices, it will always be vulnerable. If it exists only as an economic engine, it will always fluctuate. But if downtown is understood as a place for living, culture, and everyday life, it gains stability. Not growth at any cost, but resilience. Housing is central to this transformation. When people live downtown, the city gains a constant rhythm. Morning does not depend on commuters. Evenings do not fade into emptiness. Life fills the gaps. Downtown becomes a neighborhood again. This does not mean eliminating offices. It means balancing them. Mixed-use environments are not nostalgic ideals. They are practical systems. They distribute activity across time. They support transit. They keep streets alive. The next frontier is space, not more space, better space. Downtown America has plenty of land. Most of it is simply used inefficiently. Parking lots, oversized roadways, residual infrastructure. These are not permanent features. They are opportunities. Cities that reclaim even small portions of this space see outsized effects. Shorter walking distances, safer streets, more social interaction. Downtown begins to feel human again. Transportation plays a decisive role, not by eliminating cars, but by restoring choice. When walking, transit, and cycling are viable, the city becomes accessible to more people. Downtown stops being a privilege of drivers. It becomes shared ground. Importantly, this is not about aesthetics. It is about function. Cities designed for people are easier to maintain. They cost less to serve. They adapt better to change. Downtown America's future will not be defined by mega projects alone. It will be shaped by small, cumulative decisions. Allowing housing where it was once banned, removing parking minimums, reconnecting streets severed decades ago. Each change alters the system. There is also a cultural shift underway. People are rethinking proximity. Time matters more than speed. Experience matters more than throughput. Downtowns that respond to this shift will thrive. Those that resist it will struggle. The most successful downtowns of the future will not compete with suburbs by imitating them. They will offer something different. Density with comfort, activity without congestion, community without homogeneity. This moment is often described as a crisis, but crises reveal structure. They show us which assumptions still work and which do not. Downtown America's challenges are not mysteries, they are lessons. The question is not whether downtown will change, it already is. The question is whose values will shape that change, efficiency or experience, access or belonging, movement or meaning. Downtown America looks different because it was built on a different logic. Now that logic is being rewritten. Not all at once, not uniformly, but deliberately. In the end, downtown is a mirror. It reflects what a society prioritizes, what it invests in, what it protects, what it believes cities are for. The future of downtown America will not be decided by a single plan or policy. It will emerge from thousands of choices, made by planners, by developers, by residents, and by the public. If downtown becomes a place where people choose to be, not just pass through, its form will follow. Streets will narrow, buildings will adapt, life will return. Not because cities are trying to look different, but because they are choosing to function differently.
Downtown America didn't end up this way by accident. It followed a set of rules. And today, those rules are being questioned. If you look at your own city, does downtown feel like a place to live or a place to leave? What would change if people actually stayed? And if downtown were rebuilt around daily life instead of daily traffic, what would we gain?